Hello, everyone. Welcome to Coding Respiratory Diseases. These codes all begin with the letter J, and while seemingly straightforward, there's some important nuances that we're going to take a look at. Okay, once again, these codes all begin with the letter J, J00 through J99, and the breakout is shown also in your textbook. And each set, if you can kind of visualize the subdivision of this, this sometimes will help you understand why the codes are sequenced in this way. So J00 through J06 are the upper respiratory infections, and then J09 through J18, influenza and pneumonia. And then working our way down the respiratory tree, we get into the lower respiratory, we get into the other upper respiratory, and then chronic, and then the J60 through 70 diseases of the lungs due to external agents. And then we get outside of the lung with J80 through 84, respiratory diseases that are affecting the interstitium. And then we get into suppurative and necrotic conditions of the lower respiratory tract and so on. So this is a very useful kind of way of putting it. And like we've seen in other chapters, starting with J95, intraoperative and post-procedurals, and then everything else that affects the respiratory system that doesn't fit into a neat, tidy little category. J96 through J99. One of the things physicians liked about this chapter of ICD-10 is that it uses terms of main terms that physicians use. These include such things as emphysema, coded to category J43. And we can have panlobular emphysema, centrilobular emphysema, main term emphysema. J45 asthma, and again, pulmonologists use classifications as asthma as mild, intermittent, mild persistent, moderate persistent, severe persistent. And these are the kind of ways that it's documented in the chart. So if you look past the asthma and then look carefully at the subterms, you'll be able to get to the correct code. And again, you'll see a lot of instructional notes in this chapter. When a respiratory condition is described as occurring in more than one site and is not specifically indexed, it's categorized to the lower anatomical site. What does that mean? Well, we have an example here. Trachobronchitis is classified to bronchitis in J43, right? So instead, it's affecting both the trachea and the bronchi, so it's going to be coded to the bronchi being lower in the respiratory tree than the trachea. There are more notes, and you'll see a lot of these throughout, as I mentioned in the weekly announcement. These are ones we definitely want to pick up. A lot of interest in this area. Coding exposure to tobacco smoke in the perinatal period, tobacco dependence, occupational exposure to environmental tobacco, tobacco dependence, and tobacco use. And again, we didn't worry about these prior to ICD-10, but this is something that gives us the ability to collect better data and improve healthcare by coding these things correctly. So I want to make sure we do that. And there are, of course, more additional notes in the tabular. Use additional code to identify infectious agent, identify the virus, associated lung abscess, and so on. This is another chapter where if you read the tabular carefully, you'll be rewarded. And if you don't read the tabular carefully, well, that's going to be very unfortunate. You will have a lot more difficulty getting to the correct code. And again, terms that you'll see with respiratory include such things as this: acute exacerbation of chronic obstructive pulmonary bronchitis and asthma, right? Exacerbation. acute respiratory failure, which could either be a principal diagnosis or a secondary diagnosis. And the sequencing is spelled out in the guidelines. So we see a lot of these different things. We see pneumonia. Patients sometimes get pneumonia when they're on a ventilator. So it's ventilator-associated pneumonia, vaping-related disorders. A lot of interest in public health research on this as of late. Another one we have, the upper respiratory infections. So what exactly do we mean by this? Your textbook gives you a nice diagram of the respiratory system, but you can kind of think of it as upper includes the nose, sinuses, pharynx, tonsils, larynx, and trachea, right? So this is the figure I was mentioning, 13.1 in your text. Flu, every year we're advised to get our flu shot. J09 through J11 is a code category. And the other digits that follow to the right will give us the different type of codes that it is, the type of flu, the respiratory conditions that it produces, and so on. If we have flu due to identified novel influenza A virus, this is kind of like the avian flu. A lot of interest in tracking this, so I want to make sure we can code those correctly, going in J09.X subcode category. Also have a lot of interest in the swine flu, right? The H1N1 and others, right? So a lot of interest with World Health Organization about tracking these swine flu, these H1N1 influenza viruses that are in code category J10. Under subcategory J10.0, we have other influenzas that are due to other viruses. And then you'll see under J10.8, we want to identify when the flu is present with other respiratory and GI manifestations. This was a big issue with COVID-19. So I want to make sure we pick up these other manifestations. They might be things like encephalopathy, myocarditis, which was big with COVID, otitis media, all these other different types of things. And that wraps it up with flu. We'll get into pneumonia and some of the other things in the next set of video lectures. We'll see you then.